Thank you, everyone. We'll just make our way back to our seats now. It's pretty soft. If we can make our way back to our seats. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for participating in the smoking ceremony, and I want to just say thanks to Auntie Kath for doing a welcome to country and for Luke White and doing the smoking ceremony, which are very important parts of events for the Wiradjuri people in the community. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Mayor Councillor Dallas Tout and any other councillors in attendance, as well as my co-workers for all their support and for this event, and also for Dr. Joe McGurr and his support for this event. So we've got a pre-recorded video done by Linda Burney, which I'll play now.
Hi, I'm Linda. You all know me, beaming in to Wiradjuri country from a Wiradjuri woman. It makes me very proud. The voice I know you're going to be talking about, it's such an important issue for our people. It is a change to the Australian Constitution to make sure that we have a permanent seat at the table. We all know that our communities are the poorest, the sickest, the most incarcerated in the country, and the voice can change that. I hope your deliberations are very successful, and it's just wonderful you're doing this. Thank you.
Thanks for watching that video. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Joe McGurr to just have a bit of a talk about today's session. Thanks, Dr. Joe.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and Auntie Kath, thank you for your welcome to country, and as always, reminding us of the importance of that, and in this particular case, calling on the wisdom of the elders. I think this is a moment in our history where, as a nation, we need to call on the wisdom of our elders, that's for sure. It's his seniors week this week, so it's an extra time to think about that, I think. I don't want to say terribly much today, except that it's wonderful that we're having these sessions to go through this issue of the voice. Look, there is debate in the community about that, and of course, any change worth making gets a debate. You know, the ideas have to be worked through with community, talked about. And so that's legitimate that we do that. And I think this is an important part of that process. And as Linda Burney so eloquently said, this is an opportunity to make a difference to the lives of some people who have suffered enormously. The only other comment I want to make is that it's my understanding that this process commenced in 2007 when John Howard made a commitment to this. And that for 15 years, we've been working away on this, both sides of politics. All parties have committed to this process. There has been a process that we've undertaken in good faith with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And while I respect the fact that we should be debating these issues, there really should be a respect for that work. And it's my understanding that in that process, there's been different models worked through. And feedback has led to some models being rejected. And that's been accepted by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. So that we're not coming to this without a background. And I'm here to learn more about the background and the history of it. I'm not going to lecture you on that. But it's my understanding that we have been engaging in a genuine exercise of good faith. And I think there's a responsibility on the non-Indigenous community to recognise that process and respect that process and acknowledge that we've reached this point after much hard work. And of course we need to debate and discuss these issues respectfully. But I think, to be honest, my reflections on some of the comments made is that you'd think this had popped out of nowhere, and it hasn't. It's been, I think, the result of a lot of hard yakka and a hard discussion and hard work, and we need to respect that. And we've given a commitment, I think, as non-Indigenous Australians, we've given a commitment that we'd work through this. We've now reached a point where I think we need to deliver on that. So that's my view, and I wish you all the best. I'm looking forward very much to this session. Thank you. Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you, Dr. Joe McGurr. So I'd now like to invite our first guest speaker, Gemma McKinnon from HSF, to do her presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Annie Kath, for your warm welcome, and I'm so happy to be welcomed here on Wiradjuri country, and very glad to have that smoking after the 5-hour drive to get here. So feel much more calm, much more ready to speak to you all, and thank you all for coming. This is really impressive turnout, and it's really good to see people interested in hearing about the referendum that's coming up. To introduce myself, so as Bernie said, my name's Gemma McKinnon. I'm a Barkindji woman, a Webster from Wilcannia in far western New South Wales. And I am the responsible business manager at Herbert Smith Freehills, which is a global law firm with a long-standing commitment to reconciliation. I guess you're probably wondering why I'm here. The reason for that is that I have a long-standing association with the Uluṟu Statement. I was present at all 12 regional dialogues that led to the Uluru Convention, and I'll speak a little bit more detail as to what my role was there. But I'm a lawyer by trade, a former academic, and now working with HSF to deliver on reconciliation and community partnerships. So I'm happy to be back out on the road and back talking about this important topic, which I've worked for a very long time on. So thank you very much for being here. I just wanted to sort of set the scene a little bit. We are lawyers who have been invited here by Bernie and the council and the community to talk about, to provide information about the Voice to Parliament, and we'll be covering a bit of background information for people on the Uluṟu Statement, on constitutional law, on information about referenda, and information about what's envisioned for the Voice. And that point's really important, because I think what we can speak to is the law, and is what was, what the intentions were of the people who were involved in the process that brought us the Uluṟu Statement. And let me quickly also, I forgot to introduce my co-presenters. So Kashaya Delaney is here. She's a solicitor at Herbert Smith Freehills, and we've got James Blackwell here, who's with the Uluru Youth Dialogue, and I'll let them both introduce themselves in better detail, but just so you know who's in the room. So as I said, we're sort of providing information based on our legal background and on our experiences in being involved in the efforts that have to bring the proposal to a referendum. But we're not here campaigning necessarily, well, not at all. We're delivering community legal education and hopefully providing a forum for people to ask questions, and some of those questions we'll be able to answer. Some of those questions we'll be able to go away and find an answer. But some of the questions we won't be able to answer at this point. And those of us who are of voting age, what we do know is that we're going to need to make a decision. when it comes to how we vote in this referendum. And as with any election, we'll all be making these decisions based on a range of factors. People, make these decisions based on a variety of factors: politician promises, our moral compass, our appetite for change, based on the way that our parents voted, based on the way that our friends vote, thinking about how will this affect me, how will this affect my family. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is a common one when it comes to referenda. Everybody makes their decision somehow, but just like voting in a general election, while we can gather as much information as possible, we can't predict the future. We can look to the past, we can look to these legal precedents, we can look to the intentions of the people who are bringing us this proposal. But part of the exercise for each of us is going to involve accepting that there's a certain level of unknown, and making our best guess as to how it's going to turn out. And I guess thinking about who we trust and following our gut, I think, to some extent. So, as I said, we're not here to tell you how to vote, but we are here to give you as much information as we possibly can. And I hope that this will be the start of many conversations that you're going to have about the voice. One thing that we certainly encourage everybody here to do is to take this information away and talk to your families, talk to your friends and co-workers, and think about how you as a community can continue these conversations and share the information that you've learned. Because, as I said, this is a decision that we all have to make, and a successful referendum will be one where we're all making a well-informed decision. So I'm going to hand over to Kashaya to provide the bulk of the content, and I'll be here to answer any questions if anyone has them. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Gemma. So my name's Kashaya. I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman from Orange. I have family ties to the Bulgandra Bogan River Mob and the Eastwoods and Brewarrina. I'm really excited to be here with you today to help sort of unpack some of the mysteries of the Uluṟu Statement. And what I'm going to do is really cover sort of the history, what happened before the dialogues, looking back, what happened at the dialogues, and what happened since. So some of the things we're going to cover is really what is the Constitution and what do we mean by constitutional recognition, where the Uluṟu Statement came from, what is the voice and what is a referendum, how does this whole process work, and what can we kind of expect from the next sort of year or so. So to get started, let's take a look back at where we came from and the history of constitutional recognition. But before I get too far, I think it's really important to stop and get on the same page in terms of what the Constitution actually is. I'm sure most of you are aware, but people sometimes hear that word and don't automatically know what it means in our kind of legal system, in our political context. So if you've ever been a volunteer at like a sporting club or something like that, I'm sure you've had an experience with the Constitution, but it's essentially the rule book for the country. It's what sets out the division of power between the judiciary, which is the courts, the government, and the parliaments as well. It doesn't have a lot of detail about each of those things. It really just sets out the structure. And it was devised through a series of constitutional conventions back in 1890s. And it's a very old document that's only been changed a few times. All of the legislation that is created by our current parliament has to be created through one of the powers that are set out in the Constitution. So these are called heads of power. And so anytime the parliament makes a law, it needs to have a power to do that under the Constitution. The Constitution can only be changed through a referendum process where a majority of the Australian public and a majority of people in the majority of states vote yes to a change. But I'll come back to that towards the end. I think it's also really important that while we talk about constitutional recognition in the sort of more recent context about what's happened in the last 20 or so years, we need to also remember that this is something that First Nations people have been calling for in different forms for decades and decades. And the idea that this is a new thing that's just come up recently isn't accurate at all. And I think a lot of people have family that have fought for this change for a really long time. So over the last 100 years, there's been a lot of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists who have called for different things, including constitutional recognition, parliamentary representation, and agreement making. In the top left, we have Yorta Yorta elder William Cooper, who wrote a letter to King George IV in 1937. He was seeking representation for Aboriginal people in the Commonwealth Parliament. In the bottom left, we have the Yirrkala Bark petitions, and these were a really landmark call from the Yolngu people seeking land rights and parliamentary representation through a committee. In the top middle, we have the Larrakia petition, which they were also seeking political representation and land rights. And on the right here, we have the Uluṟu Statement. This statement sought self-determination, a national system of land rights, compensation, and an end to discrimination. In response to that statement, Prime Minister Bob Hawke claimed that he would have a treaty created between Aboriginal people and the Australian government by 1990, which is obviously a claim that was never met. And so all of these really do have something in common, and there has been a common thread over the past, 10 decades that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were seeking parliamentary representation in one way or another because they wanted a platform to be able to speak with Parliament directly about the things that were affecting them. In terms of the more recent history and the sort of government's response, you can see there's been a lot of different reports, a lot of different inquiries. I'm not going to go through each of these, but just to show you the volume of how much has been done. But since the Gillard government committed to constitutional recognition, we've seen 6 parliamentary processes and 9 reports on the issue of what recognition actually looks like for First Nations people. But I think really notably in 2015, which is this purple box down the bottom, a group of First Nation leaders who were drawn from representative entities nationally and the National Congress of Australia's First People issued the Kirribilli Statement to the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And what was really significant about the Kirribilli Statement was that it rejected the calls for symbolistic recognition. The idea of constitutional recognition, it's kind of, if you think of it like an umbrella term or like a spectrum, where on one side there are more symbolistic forms of recognition and on the other side there are more substantive. So the things that are seen as more symbolistic would be changing the preamble of the Constitution to say that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were here first. That is a change that would be seen as symbolistic because it wouldn't actually substantively change anything in our current system. Then on the sort of more substantive side, we have things like a voice to Parliament or changes to the races power, things like that would have sort of an ongoing substantive effect. And so what happened at Kirribilli was they specifically rejected the symbolistic recognition, the same form of recognition that was put up at the 1999 referendum and failed. And that was because what is the point of going through this entire process if it's not actually going to make a difference to anybody? And they also called for a dialogue process because never before through all of these parliamentary reports had there been a proper consultation process with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people which allowed them to have a dialogue and have a say on these matters. And so what happened after this, and I think it's also important to note that this is kind of after, this was sort of during the Recognise campaign. And the Recognise campaign was essentially advocating for constitutional recognition, but before there was really a model on the table of what that looked like. So no one had really decided whether it be symbolistic or substantive, but they were advocating for the change regardless. And a lot of mob took issue with that because, how can you push for a yes campaign if we don't even know what the question is that they're asking? So after the Kirribilli Statement, we had a new Prime Minister by then, which was Malcolm Turnbull. He set up with bipartisan support the Referendum Council to go through this process to work out what meaningful recognition actually meant to First Nations people. So then in 2016 and 2017, the Referendum Council, it was really the Indigenous Steering Committee of the Referendum Council, which was made up of some First Nation leaders. Through the vehicle of the Referendum Council, they designed an unprecedented dialogue process to actually ask First Nations people what meaningful recognition meant to them. And so they really carefully designed these dialogues, and they based them on previous models that had worked really well. And they did a trial dialogue down in Melbourne with about 70 people, and then they held 12 dialogues across the country. So you can see here, this is where each of the 12 dialogues were held. They were hosted by a local community organisation, and that community organisation helped to devise an initial list of 100 people that would be attending. They did have an open door policy, but obviously the restrictions of a government-funded process was that they initially invited 100 people, but they wanted to make sure that this process really did give a voice to the voiceless. So they wanted to make sure that there was at least 60% of people from First Nations traditional owner groups, 20% from community organisations, and 20% from just like key individuals from that community area. IATSIS was involved with helping sort of the logistics of the dialogues, you know, booking hotel rooms, things like that, but also making sure that there was a good mix of people from different genders, different age range, to ensure that it was really representative. So the dialogues followed a really structured and principled process that canvassed the different legal sort of reforms, and I guess the political vitality of the reforms, what they were and kind of whether they would work. At the dialogues, they ran for 3 days, so they ran over the course of a long weekend, and they had sessions on civics so that the attendees went through that sort of what is the Constitution, how does our system work. They learnt all about like our political and legal institutions and the role of the Constitution, and each of the different reforms. So there were 5 proposed reforms on the table which were based on the work of those previous inquiries and reports, and they were formed in a discussion. They were sort of listed in a discussion paper before the dialogues, but they were, you know, the attendees were able to propose other reforms that weren't on the table, and they were allowed to disagree with the idea of constitutional recognition as well. The purpose was just so people could have a conversation about it and try and work it out. So the 5 different reforms, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the first one was that sort of symbolistic one, the Statement of Acknowledgement of First Nations People. The second one was amending the existing racist power, which I'm going to get Gemma to speak to in a moment. There was also the option of inserting a clause that would prevent racial discrimination. There was another one which was to delete Section 25, which allows state governments to discriminate on the basis of race for voting in state. And then the 5th one was the voice to Parliament. So at each of the dialogues, they were split up into groups where they could discuss the reforms, and they really wanted to avoid groupthink, avoid one person having the loudest voice and everybody else sort of agreeing because that person was speaking the loudest. So they really tried to make sure that people were able to have conversations and have their say. So actually, I might get Gemma to jump up and quickly just speak a little bit to what the racist power is and her role in the dialogues, just to give it a bit more context.
Back again. So as Kashaya was saying, so at each of these regional dialogues, we had working groups on each of the options. And I was the technical advisor for each working group on the head of power at every dialogue. The racist power is Section 5126 of the Constitution. It's the part of the Constitution that was amended in the 1967 referendum. And that head of power gives the Commonwealth Government the power to make laws about any race of people in Australia. So we were talking in that working group about whether or not there would be potential to make amendments to that head of power, to remove the head of power. And it was very interesting, as you'll see, around the country, we had different responses to that. And I think those responses were based on different experiences that First Nations people experience around the country. So and it's also very interesting in relation to agreement making. That wasn't the preference in the Broome dialogue, for example, because in Broome they do a lot of agreement making with mining companies. and they sort of had this lived experience of how much, I guess, how often those agreements get tied up in courts, and how much of a toll it takes on the community, the division that it can cause within the community, and those sorts of things. So it was really interesting to see, as we travelled around the country, those different experiences being reflected in how the groups were responding to each option. The reason I wanted to quickly get up and speak very briefly on the head of power is it was actually the discussions in that group talking about the race's power that in the end led to people being very supportive of the voice. And the reason for that is that generally people still wanted the government to be able to make laws for First Nations people, because they make sometimes good, sometimes not so good, depending on your perspective, but that they still wanted the Commonwealth government to be able to make laws for the benefit of First Nations people. But what they sort of ended up talking about was, well, is it possible to fence in that power to make it only to make laws for the benefit of First Nations people? But of course, then the conversation then leads to, well, who is it that decides what's for our benefit, and who are the arbitrators of that decision? It inevitably comes to the High Court. What's the High Court made up of? Not First Nations people. So what the intention is that the Voice to Parliament will provide advice and guidance to Parliament on when they should and should not use the race's power to make laws about First Nations people. I'll leave it there, but just background.
Thank you. So like I said, the delegates then went through each of these reforms, and they essentially prioritised them based on their views in each particular region. And this slide really shows the outcome of those discussions. So then what happened after that is, during each of these dialogue process, they also elected representatives from each dialogue to attend the National Constitutional Convention at Uluru. And it was really up to each of the dialogues to decide how they did that. They might have done a vote, or they might have sort of just known who was going to go because of cultural authority, or however it would have worked in that particular region. And each of the dialogues, there we go. And so then in May 2017, the representatives from each of these 12 dialogues attended the National Convention at Uluru to finalise their calls for the reform. Before this convention happened, so at the dialogues, they prepared records of meetings to make sure that everything that was happened during the dialogues was recorded, that everyone's perspective was really being heard. And then what they did was they went through each of these records of meetings and they distilled the commonalities between them. And what came out of that were these 10 guiding principles for reform. So in case you can't read it clearly, it's that it does not diminish Aboriginal sovereignty and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty, that it involves substantive structural reform, that it advances self-determination and the standards established under the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, that it recognises the status and the rights of First Nations, that it tells the truth of our history, that it doesn't foreclose on future advancement, it doesn't waste this opportunity for reform, and that it provides a mechanism for First Nations agreement making. It has the support of First Nations people, and that it doesn't interfere with current and future legal arrangements. So I think, like what Gemma was saying in terms of the race's power is a really great example of the 10th point, in terms of if you fiddle with the race's power, you don't really know how it's going to impact the current arrangements. So then essentially the reforms were sort of tested against these guiding principles, and these were kind of the framework for the deliberation. So the National Convention, it wasn't about opening up the work that had been done at the dialogues and questioning the reforms again. It was about distilling the information from the dialogues to make sure that whatever came out of this process was truly representative of the voices of the people that were at the dialogues. And so to come together in what they were hoping for was a consensus. And I will note that there were 7 people that did walk out of the National Constitutional Convention over their concerns over their sovereignty. And I think that, it's always important to note that. So when we talk about the consensus that was reached at the National Constitutional Convention, we're talking about the people that stayed in the room and that were there when the process was finalised. And so when they assessed the reforms against these principles, it became really clear that the voice to Parliament and agreement making were really clear priorities. And so at the Saturday night of the National Convention, that was when the Uluṟu Statement was written, and it was read for the first time at a really special ceremony on the Sunday. And then it was later included after this whole process in the Referendum Council's final report. So this is what the Uluṟu Statement from the Heart actually is. And before I go into a lot of detail, I'm going to read it out because I know a lot of people have heard of it before, but often people haven't actually read it or sort of, heard it spoken. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent lands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people to take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our country, for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967 we were counted, in 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So the Uluṟu Statement... Thank you. So the words of the Uluru Statement are surrounded by the signatures of the delegates that attended the National Constitutional Convention, and it's surrounded also by this beautiful artwork that was painted by the traditional owners of the land in which the ceremony was held. Many people don't actually realise the size of the Uluru Statement. It's probably the size of this screen. It's quite big, so it's always quite overwhelming when you actually see it in person. So it was issued to the Australian people, and I think it's a really important thing to realise why. And it's because when you're talking about constitutional reform, it is the Australian people that have the power to make the change. All of those statements I spoke to at the start that were gifted to the parliaments, they were left to hang on the shelves of Parliament House and collect dust. And they really didn't want that to happen to the Uluru Statement, which is why it wasn't given to the politicians. It was gifted to the Australian people, and it still to this day travels around the country to be seen by different Australians so they can accept the gift within the invitation. It outlines two sequence reforms: the Voice to Parliament and a Makarrata Commission to oversee treaty and truth-telling, which is Voice, Treaty, Truth. So I'm going to discuss what these reforms are in a little bit more detail. So the first one is the constitutional enshrinement of a voice to Parliament. And this one was really strongly supported at all of the dialogues, and this isn't a new idea that's novel to Australia. It's a common thing in a lot of liberal democracies around the world. There are Sami parliaments in Norway and Sweden that represent the Indigenous people of that area, so it's not something that's completely new and an idea that's never been tested. But the idea is that the voice would be able to empower First Nations people politically. They wanted it to be a representative body that would give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a say in the law and policy that affects them. And by enshrining it in the Constitution, it would be seen as an institution of lasting significance for First Nations people and all Australians. So the idea was that the voice would allow First Nations people from local communities to have their issues and their concerns projected through the regions and the states up to the national government and onto the national legislative agenda. When they talked about the voice at the dialogues, they talked about what they wanted to see was the ability for it to give advice to the Parliament on using the race's power. And while they didn't talk about the form of the voice, because that wasn't really the question on the table, they did distinguish it from a body that has sort of service delivery functions. They saw it as a body that its entire purpose was to represent the opinions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They also spoke of the need for First Nations people to be involved in the design of the voice, and the need for the voice to be able to support and promote a treaty-making process, that it should have authority and be representative of and have legitimacy from First Nations communities across the country, and to be representational rather than a body made of hand-picked leaders by the government. They also wanted it to be supported by a guaranteed budget to ensure that what's happened with previous bodies doesn't happen again. So this was the first proposed reform that the delegates overwhelmingly agreed upon, and it was established by those delegates that it should be constitutionally enshrined. And the reasoning behind this is that many of the delegates were aware of the inherent vulnerability of legislative reform. So if the voice was to be created in legislation by a parliament and the parliament of the day decides it doesn't like that body anymore, it's very easy for the parliament to just get rid of it by repealing that piece of legislation. And they'd seen this happen before with previous bodies like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. So essentially they were sick of First Nations issues being this political football, and every time there's a change of government worrying about the integrity of that institution. So they wanted it to be enshrined in the Constitution so the very existence of the voice is maintained, but how it works and what it looks like could fluctuate over time depending on what was working and what wasn't working. They also wanted it to go through into the Constitution through a national vote, so that the Parliament couldn't get rid of it so easily, and so that the Parliament knew that it had the support of the majority of the country, because to get it through that vote, it needs to have the support. So that essentially when the government is is listening to the voice, they know that it's in the public interest to listen to its advice, because they've just seen that the majority of Australians want it there and they want it to be effective. So to get rid of the voice after that referendum, they would have to go through that referendum process again to repeal that section to get rid of it. But what it looked like and how it was formed could change over time, because the legislation would be set up to do that. So that's why it was seen as the most important and the most immediate change. The second reform is the Makarrata Commission to oversee a process of agreement making and truth telling. So I'll talk about treaty first. First Nations communities have called for agreements and treaties for hundreds of years. Like, it's been the number one thing that people have sought, because of the fact that when colonisation first started, treaty wasn't entered, and that's been kind of unfinished business for a long time. And they saw that a treaty as a pathway to recognition of sovereignty of First Nations people, and they thought that a treaty could help to ensure reparations and recognition of customary law, the guarantee of respect for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But what a treaty is essentially it's a legal agreement between two or more parties that outlines the kind of terms of engagement and the obligations of either party. Many of other countries have negotiated treaties with their Indigenous people, such as the US and Canada, New Zealand, and Australia has never had a treaty at the national level before. And I'm sure you're aware, a number of states have commenced treaty processes, but we've never had that process at a national level. But I think this is why it's really important to understand the sequencing of the reforms, because like Gemma said, delegates that had been really immersed in the agreement-making processes through native title or with mining companies knew that trying to create these really complex legal agreements without any existing structural representation with government was just really undesirable. The power imbalance and the output of that process would be really damaged by the fact that you don't have that structure to be able to negotiate on your behalf. So that's why it was seen that the Voice would be the first reform to be set up to ensure that when going through a treaty process, you can actually get the perspectives of First Nations people across the country on what they want to see in a treaty. If you look at the treaty process in Victoria, that's why they've needed to set up a body to be able to negotiate on their behalf. So that's why they sort of sequenced it in the way that they did, not because one reform is more important than the other. The third reform is truth. And so the second function of the Makarrata Commission would be to supervise processes of truth-telling. And this was intended to allow all Australians to really understand the full extent of past injustices against First Nations people, to help people understand our history and so that we can move forward in genuine reconciliation. And I find the truth element of the Uluru Statement just really fascinating, because you'll recognise that that wasn't one of the reforms that I said earlier. It wasn't one of the reforms in the discussion paper. It arose really naturally at each of the dialogues, because people would get up and they would talk about their own story or their community story, their family story, and they would tell their truth. And they talked about the sort of different historical context. They talked about ancient law and invasion resistance. And so while it wasn't an option on the table, they knew that truth was important to moving on. And so that's why truth-telling became such a significant part of the Uluru Statement. It was seen as a way to kind of change the relationship between Indigenous people and First Nations. And while there were some people that did support the idea of a national truth-telling commission, a lot of people spoke to the need of having truth-telling on a local level. So local communities working with local councils and local libraries and history groups to really unpack what happened within that local area, because we know that First Nations people are so diverse across the country, and what happened in New South Wales is very different to what happened in WA. So localising truth was seen as something really important. It's the third reform, like I said, not because of importance, but I think it's important when we talk about truth-telling to recognise that, one, it's an ongoing process. It's something that's happening all the time, and it can be something more formal, or it can be something just through conversations. But when we talk about truth-telling as a political reform, sometimes it can be used as a can-kicking exercise to kind of delay further substantive reform. And so while there have been really significant truth-telling exercises like the Bringing Them Home report and the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody, and we remember those as truth-telling experiences, they often don't lead to the substantive reform afterwards. So they didn't want to give the government an out by saying we need truth first, because that's a process that could take a long time and might not lead to substantive change immediately. Because it's something that is ongoing, that's why Voice was just seen as the first thing to ensure that there is structural reform, so that there's real change, because this truth-telling process is going to continue. So that's essentially what the Uluru Statement is: the Voice, treaty, and truth. So now I'm going to talk about what's happened since the Uluru Statement was released in 2017. And so just quickly, it's generally received quite high levels of support within First Nations communities and across the broader community as well. So this is some of the more recent polling that we've seen, but there tends to be increasing levels of support. It's fluctuating a little bit more now because we're having more of a debate and a conversation about it. But generally, the polling that's been done consistently since 2017 has shown that between 80 and 90% of First Nations people agree with a First Nations voice in the Constitution. And I think the most recent data was last month, which was the 80% figure. But across the broader community, across all levels, all political parties, there is a really strong sense of support. And the most recent polling last week showed that the majority of people do support this reform. I think it's also really important to talk about the judicial response, because while we're talking about legal reforms, it is important that these are legally sound. And so we've seen support from the Australian Law Council, numerous law firms, numerous law societies, and a lot of former Chief Justices about this, essentially talking about the strength and the ability for these reforms to work. I think one of those was former Chief Justice Murray Gleeson, who said, "A body that has the capacity to speak to the Parliament on behalf of Indigenous people should be of advantage to the Parliament as well as the nation." So these are really tested ideas. These people wouldn't be putting their names to the statements of support unless they believed that they were legally sound. We've also seen really high levels of just support amongst the broader community, corporates, organisations, unis, things like that. That's been consistently growing over the last 5 years. But I think when we come to the government response, it's a little bit different. So initially what happened in 2017 was Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull rejected the Uluṟu Statement in October 2017, so about 5 months after. So he was presented the Uluṟu Statement in the Referendum Council's final report, which listed the Uluṟu Statement, talked about the dialogues, talked about the reforms, but he rejected it and called it a third chamber, stated it would impact the foundation of all Australians having equal civic rights. And similar rejections were echoed by former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce. He also said it was a third chamber. He's also come out in recent years and apologised and said that he got it wrong, that it wouldn't be a third chamber, but there you go. And then the previous Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, also suggested that the Voice would be a third chamber in 2017. So for the most part of the political history since 2017, it's been with the coalition government. So while it looked like there wasn't really much done in this process between kind of 2017 and now, the coalition did go through a co-design process. What they did initially was they set up another committee called the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in March 2018. And that committee essentially looked at the Referendum Council's report and decided kind of what the next steps would be. They also considered some public submissions, and a lot of the public submissions talked about the need for a co-design process on the Voice to Parliament with really deep consultation and involvement with First Nations people. And a lot of them referred to the Uluru dialogue process as a form of consultation that allowed a lot of perspectives. So that committee made a set of recommendations in November 2018 and recommended that they pursue a co-design process. After that, they actually didn't really do anything with that report. Another group of First Nation leaders went to, asked for a process consistent with the Uluru dialogues to the then Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Ken Wyatt. Shortly after that, they set up the co-design process. And so there were two parts to this process. The first was they had local and regional co-design group looking at the structures that were currently in place across Australia and considering what was working, what wasn't, how they could harmonise some of those models. And then they had a national co-design group that were looking at models for a national Indigenous voice. And they presented two models in an interim report to Minister Ken Wyatt. And they ran consultations across the country with more than 9,400 people, communities and organisations participating. They used that feedback to refine it and present a final report. I think it's really important when we talk about the co-design, and you might have heard this referred to as the Wyatt report or the Karma Langton report. This was done during coalition when the coalition, they didn't have any intention of having a referendum. So this was seen as a model for a legislated voice. So when they did the consultations, they actually found when they did analysis afterwards that 90% of the submissions talked about the fact that it should be in the Constitution. But because when they set up that co-design process, their terms of reference refused to let them consider that question of whether it should be in the Constitution or not. So that model that was designed was not designed to be a constitutional voice. So a lot of people that were really advocates and supporters of the Uluṟu Statement didn't really engage with that model very much because that wasn't what was asked for. Essentially, it was just the government sort of delaying a little bit. So while that model is an example of what the Voice could look like. There's a reason why they haven't just taken that and gone, because it didn't really engage with First Nations people in the way that it should have to be a culturally, community informed model. And so one of the arguments was that, well, why don't we just legislate the voice and then go to a referendum later if that works? But a lot of people who stand behind the Uluṟu Statement believe that legislating a voice would never reach a referendum, because if the legislative voice works initially, the government will say, great, that's working, what's the point of having a referendum on that? But if it doesn't work, the government's going to say, well, no, there's no point to have a referendum. But then the body is set up in legislation, so as soon as it stops working, then it's gone, and we have the same issue that we've had with previous bodies in the past. But a legislated voice and a constitutional voice are very different things, because think about how many laws the government pass day to day every year. Most people have no idea what those laws are and don't really engage in that process. Already we're having discussions about this referendum, about whether or not there should be a voice. We're having this national process of truth-telling already. And so the voice that comes out of that process and a legislated voice are two very different things, because they could have just set up a legislative voice last year, and I would guarantee a lot of people wouldn't have known or engaged in that process. So there is a really purposeful reason why, and I know a lot of time people that are really keen supporters will say, just get it over with and legislate the voice already, but that's why it's kind of designed like that. So looking more at where we are now and what's happening at the moment. So the 2022 federal election really brought the Uluṟu Statement further into the spotlight. Before the election, Labor had committed to the Uluṟu Statement in full, including a constitutionally enshrined voice. They'd actually taken that to the 2019 election as well. That was their policy. But the coalition maintained that it was not their policy to have a referendum, so that they weren't going to be doing that, but they would legislate the voices instead. Then when we had the Labor government come in 2022, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese committed on election night to the Uluṟu Statement from the heart in full. And I think this is a real shift in terms of the conversation after this point. So to lead this work, Senator Pat Dodson was appointed Special Envoy for Reconciliation and the implementation of the Uluṟu Statement, and he works really closely with Indigenous Affairs Minister Linda Burney, the Assistant Indigenous Affairs Minister Malarndirri McCarthy, and the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus. So they're kind of the key political figures leading this work. And so while pre-election, when it was Scott Morrison, the government had intended to legislate the First Nations voice, the opposition leader Peter Dutton has indicated that he's still open to the discussions, that he thinks bipartisanship would be the best way forward, but he's still early in those discussions. He did meet with the working group last week, and in the first of meetings to come to sort of unpack it a little bit more. But he did also appoint Julian Leeser, who has been a really outspoken supporter of the Uluṟu Statement since 2017. He appointed him as the shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs. So back when that happened, it was seen as kind of a positive thing that someone that is so supportive of Uluru was appointed to that portfolio. The government's also created 3 groups to advise on the work. So there's the First Nations Referendum Working Group. They're essentially advising on how best to ensure a successful referendum, the timing of the referendum, the proposed amendment and the question, the level of detail that's necessary. Then there's a First Nations Referendum Engagement Group. So they're going to work on building community understanding, awareness and support for the referendum. And then there's a constitutional expert group. So that's like leading legal and constitutional experts who are providing legal advice on the constitutional matters that are relevant for the referendum. So in terms of where we're going and what we can really expect, it's important to note that a modern day referendum, considering our last one was in 1999, it's going to look a lot different today than it has previously. Social media will play a really big part. We've seen decreasing levels of trust and faith in politicians, which I think will play a big part as well. And many of the people voting will have never sort of seen a referendum ballot before. I know a lot of people talk about the fact that there's only been 8 successful referendum out of 44. And the most successful referendum was the 1967 referendum. But I also think it's important when you look at what those referendum were, a lot of them were about the federal government expanding their power in terms of the heads of power. So when you look at them, Australians tend to be pretty hesitant about giving the federal government more power over things. So when you look at sort of the history of referendum and things that were rejected, overwhelmingly it's a lot to do with giving them more power over services or employment and rents and things like that. So I think when we think about the context of a referendum today, it's actually very different to a lot of the ones that we've seen in the past. But essentially how it works is Section 128 of the Constitution provides for changes, and it requires 2 steps. The first is that the proposed law for changing the text has to be passed by the Parliament in the usual method, getting support in both houses. However, there is like a weird special procedure that can be invoked where it can go through one house twice. I don't know, it's weird. After that law passes, they have between 2 to 6 months to submit it to the people in a referendum. So that's the sort of timing that we'll know in terms of when that law passed. It has to happen within that time period. And then to be successful, it requires the majority of people across the nation, so thinking about the whole of the voting population, the majority of those people, but then also the majority of people in the majority of states, so 4 out of the 6 states have to vote for it as well. The ballot paper itself sets out the short title of the proposed law as approved by the Parliament, and there's a piece of legislation that kind of governs this process, the sort of way we run referendum, called the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act. But right now the federal government is trying to make changes to that to sort of, like I said, modernise it, because it's been a long time since we've had a referendum, and the way we run elections now is very different to how we ran elections in 1999. So they're kind of trying to mirror that a little bit to bring it up to speed with how we do things. So the changes that they're looking to do is requiring disclosure of campaign donations and expenditure, restricting foreign influence, supporting MPs and campaigns to communicate using modern communication methods like social media, not funding a yes or a no campaign, and supporting an education campaign to help electors understand the process and the process of the referendum and try and mitigate some of the misinformation that we see. So that's how referendum work. In terms of the wording, so we have got draft wording that has been proposed. So at Garma Festival last year, the Prime Minister announced the draft question as, do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? So the important thing about this is that the change that goes into the Constitution is just like an enabling provision. Like I said, the Constitution sets out the heads of power, but then what comes under those powers, the legislation, is the sort of control of the Parliament. So the reason why this is quite brief is because the rest of the Constitution is quite brief, and it just needs to give them the power to create the body. So they've recently also added, I think last week, this top sentence, so in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, to ensure that there is that element of recognition. But then the clauses that come under it is, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So that's just the power to create the body. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So that's representations. They may give advice, and that advice doesn't necessarily need to be that the whole of the voice wants the government to do this one thing. It might say the representatives from the voice in the eastern states think this, but the western states think this. Like, it doesn't have to give advice as a monolith. Like, it can give advice to show the diversity of perspectives. And then the final one, the Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have powers to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers and procedures. So essentially the Parliament will be able to set up the voice in the legislation and change that legislation as need be, depending on what works and what doesn't work. So this is draft wording. This will potentially change a little bit based on what those working groups are working through, but this is probably the general structure. It might just fiddle it a little bit because of the way that the Constitution needs specific wording. But the idea of creating the power to have the voice and then legislating it after is like a very common constitutional convention in terms of drafting. Like, the High Court was initially set up in the Constitution in 1901, but they didn't pass the Act to create the body until 1903 once they'd been through that process. So it's not unusual to do it this way. Most referenda, that's how it is set up. You vote on the principle and then the design comes after. In terms of what the voice could look like, the First Nations Referendum Working Group have indicated that the voice referendum will, be a vote on the principle of the voice rather than the model, and that one of the reasons for that is because the design of the model really needs to come through a process of dialogue with the Indigenous community, so that First Nations people have a say in how people are elected and represented. Then they'll sort of present that proposal to a parliamentary committee, and then the parliament, who has the power to set up the voice, will then create the voice from that. But what they have decided so far is a series of guiding principles, and they'll probably add more to this throughout the course of the year. But these ones are really based on all of those reports and inquiries that have been done previously. They can kind of decide on the commonalities. So the principles include it will provide independent advice to the Parliament and the government. It's chosen by First Nations people based on the wishes of local communities. It's representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It's empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful, culturally informed, gender-balanced, and includes youth. It's accountable and transparent, and it would work alongside existing organisations and traditional structures. It also wouldn't have that program delivery function and wouldn't have the veto power, so that it would be providing advice at all stages, so that when the government is in the very early stages, they can get advice, and that can be kind of an ongoing dialogue is the intention. So it's expected they'll add more to this list throughout the year, but that's why the position is you won't see the detail of the model. And one of the other reasons for that is because if you go to a referendum with a detailed model, then after the referendum, if you want to make changes to that model, people feel like they've been lied to, that's not what was on the table at the time. So there's a kind of art to how much detail needs to be given at referendum. It's a similar story to the 1999 Republic referendum, where how the Republic would work was really, it wasn't so much a thing of whether you wanted the Republic or not. People disagreed with the way that the president would be elected, so people disagreed with the referendum overall. So there's kind of an art to how referendums are structured to avoid these sort of problems. So that's essentially it, but I do want to touch on a few common questions that come up all the time. So the first thing is just, will the voice impact sovereignty? And I think first, when we talk about sovereignty, it's important to recognise that it does mean sort of different things to different people. In a legal sense, so it means one thing in sort of a legal sense, in a Western sense, and it means a different thing a lot of the time to First Nations people. So in a legal sense, under international law, a state can generally control all of the activities over which it has sovereignty. So it's all about power and control. But for many people, that Western definition doesn't really align with Indigenous ways of thinking. And, that's why in the Uluṟu Statement, it's described as that spiritual notion. It's the ancestral tie. It's deeply emotional, social, political. So sovereignty as like a concept is quite broad and has sort of different layers. That's why it's sort of a hard thing to talk about, because people are talking about it in different ways, if that makes sense. Under international law, Indigenous people's sovereignty can only be ceded through consent or through agreement. So historically, that would happen under treaty agreements. Treaty negotiations would be about, they would cede some sovereignty, or they'd discuss, negotiate ceding sovereignty, or there would be conquest in warfare. So neither of those things happened in Australia, which is why First Nations sovereignty has never been ceded. But when it comes to the voice, some of the best legal minds in the country have considered the issue of the voice and sovereignty and have made clear that the voice can't cede sovereignty, because in the same way it's like, it's in the same way that like the participation of Aboriginal people within the Commonwealth Parliament isn't ceding sovereignty. The very existence of an Aboriginal body within the Constitution doesn't cede sovereignty. We have to, as First Nations people, give permission to cede sovereignty. That is usually a conversation that happens at the treaty process. That's more what that's about. So The government has received advice. Most of legal experts agree that it won't really impact that sovereignty. But I know it's a common thing that people see. It's been a lot more hotly debated lately, but that's sort of that issue. And I think it's also really important to note that when we're talking about international law, there is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and First Nations people around the world do have unique rights because of that unique relationship with their traditional lands. And in that declaration it says Indigenous people would have the right to participate in decision making in matters which would affect their rights through representation chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own decision making institutions. So the voice is really consistent with the rights of Indigenous people under international law. Has there been bodies like this before? Yes, there has. There's been the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, the National Congress of First Peoples. And I think I mentioned this, but just to really emphasise, one of the reasons why they're seeking it in the Constitution is to avoid the downfalls of many previous bodies. So where there was issues in terms of the governance or the people that were sitting in those bodies, the whole thing gets canned rather than working through those issues. With National Congress, there was a change of government, they stopped receiving funding, and then that body just went into administration. So it's about ensuring continuity and a commitment on both sides to make sure that that body continues to work. And like I said, there are other bodies in other countries that do similar things. I've covered the point in terms of why don't they just create a legislative body. What sort of laws and policies could the voice give advice on? So like Gemma said, the use of the race's power, cultural heritage, things like that. The intention in terms of the voice being set up to work with local levels of government, regional, state levels of government, federal levels of government, is to ensure that the issues that impact First Nations people, like the overrepresentation of First Nations people in custody, deaths in custody, the removal of Aboriginal children, those sorts of issues would be able to be dealt with at the appropriate level of government based on where the power is. But like I'm sure you've seen the news lately about what's happening in Alice Springs. These aren't new issues. These are things that the local communities have been calling for solutions for a really long time. But being able to talk about those issues and how they can be resolved at the national level where there's power is the very purpose of the voice. And so I think the final thing is just, how do we know it will work? What do we know it will look like? And I think, like I said, we don't. And this is really about kind of the hope and this journey and sort of committing to it, working through these questions. But I think it's like any reform that we put forward on the table, we don't know, we're just hoping. So I think the more people understand it and understand the intention and what we're trying to do, then the more success, the more likelihood the voice has at success. So I'll finish there and I'll hand over to James to talk a little bit more about the Uluru dialogues and the work that they've been doing.
Thanks. Oh. It's a hype thing. Thanks, Kashaya, and thank you, Auntie Kath and Dr. McGurr for having us here, and to Uluṟu Council as well, and thank you to Bernard for being such a great organiser of this and getting us all to come down here. My name is James Blackwell. I'm a Wiradjuri man with ties to Gundagai, Chumut and Cowra, although I'm currently based on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. I work at the ANU. I'm mainly an educator there, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't hold that against me, or do hold it against me, depending on your view. You all look a little bit tired, so why don't we take 5 seconds to just, I'm using my inner educator. We all stand up for 5 seconds, just shake our arms out, have a stretch, get those achy knees and elbows out. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate that. So yeah, now we've kind of had a bit of a break from the sitting down. So I'm from the Uluru Dialogue at UNSW, although I also work at the ANU. We are the body that stemmed from the 2017 Constitutional Convention in support of the Uluṟu Statement. We're based out of UNSW at the Indigenous Law Centre. So I'm here both to educate and to do a teensy tiny bit of campaigning, but hopefully it's so subtle you won't even notice that I've done it. But if I have, then you can call me out on that. So the Uluru dialogue, let me get my notes up in front of me as well so I don't have to keep turning around. I'm used to having the TV screen in front of me when I'm teaching rather than having it behind me. So the Uluru dialogue we represent the cultural authority of the Uluṟu Statement. So all of those delegates that were at Uluru in 2017 and were at the regional dialogues through 2016 and 17. And if I turn around niftily, you can see all the dates in the back of my shirt to all those dialogues that were just run through with you there. So as I said, we're based out of the Indigenous Law Centre at UNSW Sydney, but we do travel the country. We have members around the country from Rockhampton, Cairns, Darwin, Perth, Canberra, Melbourne, all around the country. And we're comprised of those who were at Uluru in 2017 who signed the statement, those who were at the regional dialogues, and also those like myself who've come on board as academics, as advocates in the years since. So we're led by our two co-chairs, Auntie Pat Anderson, an Yarrawa woman from the NT, and Professor Megan Davis, a Cobble woman from Queensland. And Auntie Pat was the co-chair of the Referendum Council, which led the regional dialogue and convention process in 2017. And Professor Davis was the person who helped design and develop the regional dialogue process and is one of the leading experts in constitutional law in the country. So they're our co-chairs. They lead our work in regards to supporting the statement, educating people on what the voice is, why it's important, what it will do, and they're our guiding inspiration for a lot of our work, along with many, many elders and community members who are part of the dialogue. We also have the Uluru Youth Network, which Gemma indicated earlier. We're a collective of young First Nations peoples who support the statement, and we stand by that mandate of the statement to support voice, treaty, truth. We're aged between 18 and 30. Yes, I am under 30. It doesn't look like it, but I am. And we come together from a lot of different areas, countries, waterways. We represent a large group of people around the country, but we are the Uluru Youth Dialogue, and we do a lot of activism work. There's one of our meetings there with not all of, but some of our members. We've been to things like the Indigenous All-Stars game to help campaign and spread the word. We've got folks going to the All-Stars game in Rotorua this year in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we do a lot of public events, campaigning around the statement, educating people. We write, we speak on radio, we speak to our communities, and really are the forefront of the education campaign of the statement. So the mission of the dialogue is really bound to that sentiment of the statement itself. What kind of country do we want to see? What better Australia do we want to see for us, for our children, for our futures, and for the whole nation? And we're committed to that constitutional voice, that seeking a voice for our people in the parliament and in government, and establishing a Makarrata Commission for treaty and agreement making. That is our main goal here, is to educate and support that work as it goes forward, including this year during the referendum. So this is a bit of rehashing, and apologies if I'm going over stuff you've just sat through, but the 12 regional dialogues and the Constitutional Convention developed what we now know as the Uluṟu Statement from the Heart, which calls for that process of voice, treaty and truth. And it's very clear and deliberate in its sequencing and its order for how it seeks to empower change in this country for us as First Nations peoples. And so this year we are going to a referendum on the first of those steps, which is the voice to Parliament. And that's the culmination of the last 5 or 6 years of work on, actually even going back longer, as Dr. McGurr hinted at with John Howard's work. So this goes back a very long time, and this referendum this year is the culmination of that. It's also the first referendum in 24 years, so if you're under the age of 41, you've never voted in a referendum before, and it's brand new experience for all of us who are under that age limit. So it's very new to us. It's very new to a lot of people in this country. It's something we don't do very often, or we don't do very often now. We used to do them quite frequently, but they've become less frequent over time. And so this referendum is ensuring basically two principles: that we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this country, and that we ensure that we have a voice, that we have the ability to speak to the matters that affect us, that the things that we care about, that the things that government does that impact upon us. That's the principles of the statement from the heart, and it's the principles of this referendum. The questions about detail, of course, are very important, but it's really about those two fundamental principles, recognition and consultation. So as part of that, our work at the Dialogue involves educating and informing people on the statement and what's gone into it, how it's worked, what it's going to look like going forward. That picture there with the pamphlet, there is that pamphlet over on that table over there on the way out, along with some other pamphlets. So if you do want to get some information from us, it's all there in kind of neat packaged paper form. And we do kind of have a lot of these brochures and booklets that we give out and then we share, and they're also all available online for people to understand further what the questions on detail are, what the questions on principle are, why this is important, who's campaigning for it, why we're campaigning for it. So all that stuff is available, but we do the work as Dialogue members of going out and kind of speaking to people, taking questions on these issues. So I'm going to go through a bit of a kind of like a explaining of what the voice is. Again, this is a bit of a repeat, but I think this kind of sort of table shows it quite succinctly in terms of what it is and what it isn't. So it's a constitutionally enshrined body adjacent to the Parliament. It's not a third chamber of the Parliament. It's alongside, supporting, enabling, but not within the Parliament. It has the ability to review legislation and government decisions and provide input, but it doesn't have veto power. We're not going to have the power to stop legislation, but to provide advice and input and culturally appropriate, wisdom, in a sense, to the Parliament on matters that affect us. It's a representative body, so it's going to be made up of members chosen by our communities. It's not Indigenous only seats within the Parliament, something you may have heard recently in the news. It's not that. We are separate from the Parliament, but it's representative of us. So our communities will determine amongst themselves how we're elected. So what works, say, in the Torres Strait may not work here on Wiradjuri country, and that's fine. We're different communities with different needs. So how we choose our members from this region may differ to how other regions choose their members. It'll be up to us in different regions to work out what best suits our needs. Its only function is to provide a voice and platform for us on issues that affect us. It's not something with investigatory powers like a Royal Commission. It hasn't got a limited timeline. It's an ongoing thing that is designed to give us a say over matters that affect us. And I know I keep rehashing that, but it really is a very basic core principle. That's what this is about. In terms of its functions, it gives us the ability to speak directly to government, to talk directly to ministers, to parliamentarians, elected officials, and also, more importantly, bureaucrats. So that's another area, It's not just the parliamentarians, it's those in the public service as well. It doesn't give us a veto or control over legislation and government decisions. As I said earlier, it's very much about input and having a say over these matters that affect us. It allows us to have proper, authentic representation from community, so people from community who actually know what's going on in community rather than bureaucrats in Canberra or academics in the academic space. It allows people from our communities to have a genuine say in the Parliament. It would not make us and our people subject to political parties or lobby groups. So the folks that are there for the voice are there to represent our communities, not Labor, not Liberal, not the Greens, not Clive Palmer, not any of the political parties. We're there as individuals to represent our communities. It also gives our sovereignty force in decision making. It gives our cultural authority power in the Parliament, the ability to speak to that, to present that to the Parliament, show the richness and value of that to people that for so long have ignored it. It doesn't cede our sovereignty, as Kashaya has already talked about. It's going to help improve our outcomes. We've seen time and time again where government does listen to us in the very rare cases that it does. When government does engage with us authentically with genuine representation, our outcomes are better. What occurs for our community is improved. We see that time and time again. So what this voice does is give that permanently on every issue, not just a hodgepodge selection of issues. And what this doesn't do is it doesn't divide us as a country. It's merely giving us, as the first peoples of this country, a say over these very important decisions that have a great weight on us. We're very affected by the way government decides things on land rights, on taxation, on healthcare, education. These things are really important to us. So giving us a voice gives us that say, gives us that ability to speak to the Parliament directly, not through other interest groups, not through other organisations, but directly to the Parliament. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because there's so many, there's a myriad of government decisions that impact us as First Nations peoples. You know, you probably all are aware of the statistics and the information about how much disadvantage there can be in some communities. Well, this gives us that involvement. You know, this gives us that ability to speak to the parliament, to speak to the government. It allows us to build a better future for our children. You know, when our outcomes are improved, our children's lives improve. They're more connected to culture, they're more connected to community, because that community has an ability to make decisions that are relevant to us, to mob here. And also gives us recognition in this country, finally. It says the government, this country's founding document, recognises our position as First Peoples. It recognises our position as the sovereign custodians of this land. And that's really important. It's really important that we as a country do that. If we don't do that, you know, we kind of get stuck in this position of continual neglect of our peoples. Now, if we're talking support for the voice, you know, this is a really grassroots movement across the country. There's a lot of, sorry, that graph should be a bit bigger, but I think the slides have shrunk on me. You know, 80% of First Nations people support this change across the country. So it really has a lot of support from every state and territory, from our communities. This is the change we want to see. It also has support across the general population, across everyone, you know, on average, everyone in this room, everyone in various towns and cities. And we've seen that in that graph there from the ABC, you know, that support has grown over time. So we're seeing, as people understand what this is about and understand the importance of this, they begin to continue, they begin to support it, to come out and advocate for it. But of course, we need everyone's support, which is why we're here today talking to you, to try and encourage you that this is something worth considering. This is, when you go to that ballot box this year, having a think about how important this is to First Nations peoples, and how important this is to this country that we vote for this and that we support this. So now, if you are thinking of supporting and thinking of being an advocate for this, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can write to your MP or speak to him, he's just there. At a state level, at a federal level, local councils as well, they're in the building, about your support for this, encouraging them to also support and advocate for it as an issue. You know, this obviously was given to the Australian people, but politicians have a really important voice in our communities, and so encouraging them to support something by showing it as a constituent and something you care about, that's really important. It really helps generate momentum. You can talk to your family members, your cousins, your siblings, your colleagues, talk to people at work, your students if you're an educator, about why this is important, why you care about it, why you think it's worth people listening to. You can sign up to our newsletter as well. You know, we have information about kind of current events. We put out pamphlets that way, advertise events like this. And you can purchase merchandise from the Iconic. We're also selling some tonight if you are interested, but you don't have to. See, that was the tiny bit of campaigning. Blink, you missed it. Now, we do invite you to join us on this movement. This is a movement of the Australian people. The Uluṟu Statement was gifted to you on purpose because only you have the power to make that change in our constitution. So we really do call on all of you to support this movement by voting yes in the referendum, and so we can finally have a say over the issues that affect us. So we can finally have that voice to government. We've had our voice for a very long time. We've had our sovereign voice as peoples for millennia, but we need government, the government that is here now, to also listen to that. Now, if you want to find out more, you can go to our website, www.ulurustatement.org. We also have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I believe TikTok. We have TikTok. If you're young enough to know how to use that, you can go on TikTok and find us there as well. So we have a number of kind of social media avenues and things like that as well. And also we're here to take any questions anyone might have. I think that's the next. Yeah. Oh, I'll pass on to Bernard though.
Yeah, so thanks to all the presenters for the information. We know that it's a lot of information and you might want to go away and you may have questions later. We are going to send out an email with the opportunity for people to submit questions after tonight. But now we're sort of going to have sort of a question session with the presenters, and there's also been some catering provided. So it's just a very informal sort of opportunity now where you might have some questions to ask. But yeah, also help yourself to the food as well.
some sections of the media, we have Indigenous people who are coming out and speaking against the voice. They're arguing strongly that, you know, they should have treaty before having the voice and sovereignty. Now, we know that sovereignty can't work within the Constitution because I've heard constitutional lawyers come out and say that in the last week. So how do we get the message across to these, and the sections of the media saying, oh, they're, you know, well-respected people in the community and the Aboriginal community. Rightio, it doesn't matter what we are or what nationality, you're never going to get 100% people agree with you. So how do we get the message and sell the message to these people that before they can have treaty, or how do we get the voice is the big way of getting treaty, and we also should sell to the rest of the community, the non-Indigenous people, that 80% of the people who are Indigenous are supporting this. I think that should be made really public.
Thank you. That's actually a really good question. Look, I mean, as you said, you're not going to get every person in the community to agree on this. There are Aboriginal people who are in my family who are, you know, I'm very close with, who don't support this, and they're entitled to, right? They have every right to not think this is the way forward. I think what I would say is, you know, that's their sovereign right as First Peoples to not support this. But 80% of our mob do support it, and I think when you'll see coming referendum day that the majority of Australian people do as well. So there are going to be people in the media who don't support this or who think it's not the right way to go, and that's fine. It's part of a healthy political debate that we all don't agree. I'm sure we all don't vote the same way in this room, even. So there's, you know, that's just kind of a very healthy part of democracy that we all don't agree. I think it's obviously, you know, it's disappointing that people don't agree, that people are saying certain things in the media, but that's their right to do so. I think it's about all of us as individuals who do support it going out and having these conversations with family, with friends, with colleagues about, you know, about what's been said. You know, do you agree with that? Why is that? Why do you not agree with that? And things like that. And emphasising and uplifting the voices of Aboriginal people who do support it, if you are a supporter. You know, if you see, you know, you've got people like Megan Davis on TV quite a bit, Arnie Pat Anderson, you know, Kashaya does media as well. You may see me on the radio every now and again. You know, sharing those things around as well, you know, sharing the voices of people who are supporting it if you are looking to encourage others to vote for it. But again, you know, you've got people across the community who, you know, who don't agree with this, and that's fine. They're entitled to, but I think come referendum day, you'll see the results of the voice, and hopefully when the voice works and it does come up and it is successful and we move towards treaty, you know, we can then focus on that as a goal, and you'll see those people perhaps come back into the discussion around how then best to pursue treaty. You know, there's a lot of people who've been working on treaty for a very long time and have a lot of very important things to say about it. So when we get to the treaty discussion, those people are going to be vital to pursuing that agenda. But for now, you know, they don't support the voice, and that's entirely fine. I think, you know, it's healthier that we have disagreement rather than all of us agreeing the same thing. But that's kind of I'll give Kashaya a go as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think it's hard right now because we're still quite a way out from the referendum day, but there is a number of months to come, and I think the problem that we have at the moment in terms of the media and the misinformation is that a lot of people don't understand it enough to really question both sides of the conversation and really engage, and I think that's what tends to confuse a lot of people because, like James said, we aren't a monolith. People are going to disagree, and I think a lot of the really prominent Aboriginal voices right now have that platform to have their voice and say their piece, but I do hope that these sorts of conversations and helping people to understand it at a sort of a deeper level allows people to get a lot more out of those conversations. And so I feel like it's really important for people to look at the media and really question who it is and what they're saying, and really question whether that what they're saying is accurate, because I think a lot of journalists probably don't understand this as much as they should, so they tend to report without questioning things. It's the same thing that happens every time we have an election. People are sort of reporting on things that they don't fully understand. So I think it is hard, and we haven't touched on it yet, but I think this debate in and of itself will be really hard for First Nations people. So I think it's important to look out for your family and friends that are our First Nations are a part of this, because these debates and stuff can be really conflicting, but there is a long way to go. So I feel like there is confusion, but I think people take a lot of comfort in the fact that the polls do show that the majority of First Nations people support it, and like you said, we're never going to have 100%.
I'm interested in the model of the body, the voice. We recognise there are at least 300 plus Indigenous nations, plus other interest groups. Yet the body, do you have some sort of model you're thinking or working on? Because you can't have 300 plus interest people in this body. So how are we going to form a body that represents all these people without having a huge brawl or a fight or whatever?
Yeah, I think this really goes to one, in terms of what Gemma was saying about the things that we do know and the things that we don't know. And I think in response to your question, the way that we can talk about how it was intended at the dialogues, and the intention was that there would be representatives at local levels that would feed through to bodies at regional or state levels that would feed through to national levels. So rather than it being really one body speaking at a national level that represents everybody at a local level, it would kind of feed through in that way to ensure that people can consult at the different levels of government. That's the intention, and that's kind of a similar thing to what the CoDesign report came out with. But I think we can't really answer those questions, because realistically, if the government did have a model on the table right now, it would be a model that has not been properly informed and not been properly designed by community. So it is hard to say we don't know, but we don't know because that process has to come after the referendum. That's the approach that the government is taking, and that's the approach that the dialogues has as well, that we can't put the cart before the horse. We have to get the referendum passed to ensure that there's a proper dialogue process where how people will be elected and things can be determined by the communities that are picking those representatives. So I'm sorry that it's probably not the fulsome answer that you would hope for, but that is the answer that we have. Sorry, I just... It's okay.
In our constitution, so the next government that comes in that might be as friendly to us as First Nations people, it doesn't change.
Yeah.
So that's my aspect around the voice.
Yeah.
But also with how it will look, we don't know that yet, because I always say nothing for us without us.
Yeah.
So we need to have those conversations to see how it looks.
Yeah.
So that's my view.
A lot of the things that we are talking about impact multicultural Australia. Where is the multicultural information so that those multicultural people whose English may not be their first language are informed and can make a valid referendum commitment?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Uluṟu Statement has been translated into over 60 languages, I think, including a lot of First Nation languages. But in terms of the referendum process, that's something that the Australian Electoral Commission is actively working on, translating all the information about the referendum and about the proposal and stuff into a multitude of languages. So it will be available. The different languages are available in recordings and written on the Uluṟu Statement website, and I think on SBS as well. So very much a really significant issue, and it's definitely something that people are working on. Did you want to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, just to also say, as the Uluru Dialogue, we've also partnered with FECA, which is the big body for the ethnic and multicultural communities, and they've put out a lot of resources to their member organisations in community languages about the referendum, about the voice. So there is a strong support from the multicultural community and their organisations, and we're working with them very strongly to put out resources in their languages, but also, yes, as Kashaya said, the government will also do a fair bit of that as well.
Was there any more questions? Yep.
I want to thank you for your very excellent contribution tonight and the display. 2 or 3 of the slides that you showed, the summary slides, I think need to be widely distributed to all organisations, groups, clubs, churches, everything in Wagga, because they are the best summaries that I have seen. They're even clearer than these 2 documents, if I'm allowed to say so. I would like to see wide distribution of those and availability. So when I go to my Rotary Club, I'm wearing a Rotary shirt because I've been at a Rotary event, not because I'm advertising Rotary. I'll come straight here. And I wasn't sure that I could get here because I hadn't booked and it wasn't clear that I would be welcome to come in. You need to improve your communication as well and make the access to all this material very, very easy. That would be a good start, those slides.
I was the deputy manager in this region for ATSIC when we were shut down. And I'm just wondering if there's any kind of, and I understand the need for constitutional ensuring that something goes on, because there was an excellent review done at the end of ATSIC's time, which was just shelved because we ended up having a hostile Senate that could get rid of us. Because at that time, Labor had an unusual leader at that time who gave power government numbers. Anyway, that's politics of it. But just how do we learn from some of the great things that were done at a regional level that I'm aware of in this region, and I'm still involved with some of the fruit of that time. Just it's really important, and I wonder if that's being thought about. I mean, I know it's a very different model with no funding.
Yeah. I think that was like during the dialogues they did talk about the different bodies that have been in existence, and I think that process of designing the body will take into account the previous bodies and what has worked and what hasn't worked, because there has been so many, and they did have really, some had bad things about them, but a lot of them had really great things about them. So I think that gives comfort to the fact that this isn't a blank slate that we're working from, but within this region people know what worked, and so by going through a proper design process, those are the types of things that they'll be able to hopefully pick up on. Yeah.
Was there any other questions? But if you can't think of a question now, or if you're still trying to digest all the information, we will be sending out an opportunity for LV attendees today to send through their questions for the presenters, and we'll put together a frequently asked question package for everyone. And also, if all the First Nations people, tomorrow will be having a Q&A session with the presenters as well. But yeah, thank you for attending, everyone. There is food to be taken and eaten. But yeah, thank you to the presenters. Thank you for everyone for attending. Thanks.